shadow dances, I am still. Peace is my companion. Joy is my friend. The campfire, the stars, the slight breeze, the taste of the hot chocolate, and the dancing shadows are, in themselves, enough. Here I am. Why waste time wanting to be somewhere else? Join me by the campfire.
Hello, everyone, for another episode of Campfire Philosophy with J. Aaron Simmons. I am J. Aaron Simmons. Go by Aaron. But this week, I discovered that there is apparently another philosophy podcast called Campfire Philosophy, anchored in Scotland. And greetings to Hamish and his partner for reaching out to me and notifying me. It was not a cease and desist, but a, hey, are you aware? We've been doing this for a long time. And so now I have to make sure that this is Campfire Philosophy with J. Aaron Simmons to distinguish from their Campfire Philosophy. But hopefully, Hamish and I will actually be able to collaborate and do some sort of cross-pollination as things go forward. So super stoked about what they're doing. Glad to know about their work and hope we can partner in the future. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us live. This is going to be an exciting episode with two friends of mine to discuss not so much the question, but the declarative sentence, which is why we need public intellectuals. Or maybe we just think of it as why we think in public and why it matters we do so really well. And I am joined tonight at the campfire by my old friend, both in timing and in aged wisdom, Tom Morris, who is a former professor at Notre Dame and now is an absolute guru of all things just philosophy for everyone. He has written so many books, I stopped counting. It did require all of my fingers and toes. And recently actually just did a wonderful book called Stoicism for Dummies, and highly recommend. He's had several best-selling books and is available to speak at your company or your organization, and he is fantastic. So Tom, so glad to have you with us. And my second guest here at the campfire is someone I have not known as long and yet have become quickly a huge fan of her work. This is Kristin Tideman, who is a theologian extraordinaire and also a podcast host herself. You can check out her current podcast, Petty and Prophetic. And also, she actually has a wonderful podcast from a few years ago that has some amazing content called I Don't Live Here Anymore, all about her relationship to and deconstruction from evangelical Christianity. So highly recommend both of those. And then also, as a kind of cool side project, she works with a mutual friend of ours doing some amazing work for primarily academics who are wanting to do this kind of public work. And so you can find out more about Kristin's consulting company, Tideco. And yeah, you both are amazing. You do all the things well, and I am honored to have you both with me tonight. So thanks for being here at the campfire.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here alongside Tom. That's the nicest introduction I think anyone's ever given me in my life. So,
well, I'm glad to be here, despite being described as so old. I'm just glad it's not a debate, you know. But there's a voice in my head, Aaron. There's a voice in my head saying, "Look, I'm just 72 years old. I mean, within the next decade, I could still, run for president or something."
That's right.
There you go.
I could use the immunity. You know?
That's right. As long as at no point tonight do you claim to be done with Medicare, we will be good to go, I think.
Yeah, we're good.
It might be too
Medicare is
soon.
safe with me.
Well, and in fact, the all joking aside, or maybe jokes intended, part of why I invited you both to join me tonight was this episode originally was going to look different, and I re-envisioned it to think about public intellectual work and why it's so needed today, precisely in light of the last few weeks of what I would describe, democracy in real time, right? Watching this active, not even just social, but global discussion about not only, hey, who is most likely to beat Trump or who should the Democrats nominate, but questions more like, how do we make sense of aging? What does it look like to consider loyalty a social good or maybe a hamstring for deliberative engagement? How ought we make sense of identity as it relates to being a truth teller? What's the role of argument in public discourse, right? Like what we've watched is all of the stuff that we need to be really good at. And unfortunately, I don't think we as a society are very good. No. And this is where, inviting people who model what it looks like to think in public together to think about why we need to think better in public, that seemed like a really, really great idea, and one that was urgently speaking to our times right now. So that was the thought of why, hey, it's not just, Tom, that you're a little bit older than me. It's a matter of saying, no, precisely what we all bring to the table, different generations, different perspectives, philosophy versus theology, different approaches to deliberative engagement. This is something we should be good at. And maybe the stakes are higher than most people even realize. And so that's what I'm hoping to think with you all about.
Kristin, I don't know about you, but when Aaron just stated the topics that have come up in the last few weeks, I mean, he's the first person that I've heard clarify the topics that were coming up. And that's one purpose of a public intellectual right there. I mean, to make clear the contours of what's on people's minds. I mean, have you had that kind of feeling about the past few weeks? There were a lot of topics in the air, but nobody was really clarifying what they were.
Yeah. I mean, well, when I was joking around with friends, I'm like, it just keeps getting a little crazier. And like, and everyone kind of piles on. You see the same opinion, 50 times in a day, but to get into like the nuance, to actually to do what Aaron's saying, step back and say, what does it mean to think well? That is rare. So yeah, and now I pulled my pen out because I was like, oh, he's saying so much, I have to write some notes down.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of envisioning this episode in two parts. The first part is I'm fascinated. I mean, normally at the Campfire Philosophy, it's not meant to be an interview. The idea is we all kind of know each other. And so we're like starting from 60 and pushing on to 85 or 90 miles an hour. But tonight, I actually think there's a reason for us to talk a little bit about how we got involved doing philosophy, theology, intellectual work in public spaces, right? And how that has become something that we have found either a calling toward or something that we have, stumbled and fell and landed in front of people and talked about stuff. And so I kind of want to think about that with you. And then in the second half, I do want to then return to, so where are we? And what are the questions, the issues, the kinds of encouragements that we need to model for people as intellectuals thinking in public? And let me make clear, big footnote, being an intellectual, being a professor, being a philosopher, theologian, none of that means that what you say or think is true. You might be really sophisticated and wrong. Right. So I always want to make sure people understand when intellectuals get together to think with each other, none of us assume, well, I must be right because of this training. We assume I'm probably missing something and need to be in the room with really smart people to help me know what it is I've overlooked.
And that's the hope for tonight. That intellectual humility, that little dose of intellectual humility. There's an interesting thing about that. It kind of happened for me in graduate school when I realized that to be important in their own time or across time, philosophers didn't have to be right about everything. They just had to be stimulating, so that it wasn't that we come to them because they got everything right. It's that we come to them because they help us ask better questions. They help us think through things ourselves. So if we could perform that function more for people in our time without a lot of this ex cathedra, here's what the truth is, I think we'd be helping everybody to be better thinkers.
Yeah. I think that's right. Yeah. I think that's right. And it's fascinating. Kristin's done a lot of work, and I want you to tell people about this, Kristin, but with some of our mutual friends, Trip Fuller, Dan Koch, Josh Patterson, all these people doing amazing work, Tim Whitaker, in the, for lack of a better term, kind of progressive Christian space or deconstructive Christian space. And it's interesting because I think what it is that crew does most effectively is say, hey, here's where we've got questions that the traditional communities and answers left us sort of, they fell short for us. So let's raise those questions in new ways and think in public to invite people to wrestle with their own struggles, right? I don't see that crowd saying, hey, here's what you should think about God. Here's how we should go forward. They're like, well, Christian nationalism's effed up. Like, don't do that. Right.
Yeah.
But that doesn't entirely mean that we're all going to land in the same space, even if we appreciate where some of the pressure points or critique directions are. Right. What has your experience been, Kristin, as far as like how you found yourself in public with an audience thinking about God, theology, ethics in these sorts of public ways?
Oh man. Well, the one thought that I think is the starting place of my kind of story in this whole world is that when I went to grad school, I think I was looking to become an apologist, a Christian apologist. And I was very influenced by C.S. Lewis's nonfiction work. I read so much of that when I was in especially college, and was kind of like, I had like a collection book that I remember, like I was like, here, to my friend who was like not a Christian. I'm like, he like borrowed it, and I'm like, I'm like a witness, all these things, because I went to not a Christian college. I went to a Christian school for grad school, actually. So when I went to Trinity Western, I was like, okay, well, I know some of the stuff, but I'm really gonna get to know all the answers, which is so funny with what you say, Aaron. It's kind of the opposite perspective. And it really was a process of learning to even approach the topics differently in a more open way, and with some of that intellectual humility. Simply because I really realized I could not know. I couldn't know the way I had wanted to. And it was humbling just through the process. But especially that the podcast you mentioned, I Don't Live Here Anymore, that was my grad thesis project. And the interviews I went through, I think even going into it, I wanted to get a solid answer. And I ended up just essentially, the thing is a collection of questions from really and engaging with them with really smart people. I was so grateful for the access that I got, a lot of recommendations from my advisor. And it left me in a place where I was like, this is what it means to not totally know, which was kind of a foreign way of thinking, but has changed so much for me. And I think that's where I continue to be involved. And it's funny, I don't know all the directions this is going to go. There's certain things, like I'm still involved with Theology Beer Camp and helping that, just exist, helping run it, helping bring people to it. That is a huge part of what I do. And of course, now my business, popularizing ideas and helping to get the message out about great projects. But it's something where I think even talking about, I'm like, it's making me realize I didn't know how much of this I was doing. You almost can't get away from it sometimes. So I still feel very new in my journey in terms of like, it's not just school related anymore. It's like, now it's my life. But that's a little peek into how I got started.
Well, it's fascinating, your claim about starting because you thought you had everything figured out and wanted to go be an apologist. Yes. The irony, of course, is I've read some of Tom's early work, which has a much more, I wouldn't say apologetic, but a much more confidence-inspiring rationale for the truth of Christian theism, let's just say. And it was actually super influential on my own early development. Some of Tom's early work was, C.S. Lewis to the budding philosopher that I was. Now, I also read a bunch of C.S. Lewis for what it's worth. And apologetics was kind of this, how would I describe it? It was the thing that made me see that one could be a Christian in particular, which again, for those watching, I identify as a Pentecostal Christian, though I'm also a professor of postmodern philosophy of religion. So it creates a complicated dynamic both at church and in the academy. But my early struggles to become an academic, it was more, what does it look like to let these questions be questions in robust ways? And though I had been raised by a family, both my parents were professors, but my maternal grandfather was a pastor. And so my experiences of the church when I was growing up never were, this shut your brain off. It was always, no, let's think more deeply. Let's wrestle with this stuff. I remember vividly sitting at my grandma and grandpa's kitchen table on Sunday afternoons and them pulling out the lexicon, because they were like, the pastor's account of that term was just not right. And they're like, pulling up the Greek and checking, and then like calling the pastor and saying, hey, you need to get your Greek on, right? And yet neither of them had advanced degrees. They were thinkers, but they were not academics, right? And so my experience of Christianity was never one of stop thinking to have faith. But then when I got to grad school, it was there that I was told, oh, you can't really take this Christianity stuff seriously. You're too good of a thinker. And so I needed those people, the Alvin Planigas and Nick Wolterstorffs and, Mavrodis and others kind of modeling for me what it looked like, the Tom Morrises, to model what it looked like to take this stuff seriously. I think to their chagrin, for what it's worth, it didn't give me a firm place to stand and then go to battle for the faith. What it did was actually made me realize, part of what faithfulness looks like, and also the core of what being a philosopher is about, is this radical humility where we stand on purpose while recognizing there's other places we could stand, right? That I'm not irrational if I stand elsewhere. And I might be wrong standing where I find myself. All of that became true for me. And it was in that space, and then running into Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and others, that Christianity emerged as this possible thing for me on the other side of grad school, right? Which is so in a weird way, you and I, Kristin, have kind of similar early moments, similar landing spots, but the route there, it wasn't deconstruction for me in the sense of walking away from my faith and reconstructing it. It was building from the resources in deconstructive philosophy. It was Derrida, it was Nietzsche, it was Foucault. It was actually learning deconstructionism that prevented me from ever deconstructing, which is a whole separate episode that we probably should have. But it's just so interesting to hear your story, because part of why I think I'm a philosopher in public is rooted in the fact that my Christian journey was also connected to being in front of people. So I was a professional musician and a drummer. So I grew up my whole life being on stage. And so then when I became a professor, I loved the libraries. But for me, it was man, the audience feedback and finding ways to make people nod their head. And, how is it they can be kind of grooving with this beat I'm laying down? Surely there's a way to do that with philosophy. And so for me, that's where the public philosophy kind of emerged. So what about you, Tom? I mean, I'm referring to your stuff as an inspiration. Well, how is it that you found yourself?
Yeah.
The thing you mentioned about music, I played in bands. I traveled in bands before I was a philosopher, and
he's a guitar player.
Yeah. Both so cool. Oh my god.
Like Aaron, I still got the stuff around. In this room, I probably have 4 guitars in my study, but probably 12 or 14 in the house. And it's that certain kind of energy and that certain kind of engagement with large numbers of people, so that people didn't know, kept asking me at Notre Dame, are you just a natural performer? It's like a one-man Broadway show, your class. It's why is, I said, well, I played in bands so long, I just think I know what it's like to engage with a certain level of energy. And my favorite book about teaching, which I only read, this is what we're like, we academics. Some graduate students came to my office one day. They said, they teach us philosophy, but they don't teach us how to teach. Your class is the most popular classes. So could you come to the graduate students and just give us a private session on how to teach? And I said, sure.
Wow.
10 minutes after he left my office, I went over to the library and checked out 10 books on how to teach. And so I had something to say. That's academic life in a nutshell. I had been doing this for 10 years, and I thought I had to read these books. All of them were a paragraph's worth of ideas stretched over 200 pages, except one book called Mastering the Techniques of Teaching. I think it was a guy, Joseph Lohman at Chapel Hill, where I'd done it at my undergraduate. And his main theme was the classroom is a dramatic arena. From the moment you enter it, the moment you leave, everything that happens in that arena either conspires in favor of what you're trying to accomplish or detracts from what you're trying to accomplish. You need to orchestrate that room. You need to occupy that space. You need to make creative things happen, kind of make the magic happen in that setting. And I realized that's what I did naturally, right? So when I first got, I thought I was going to be my whole life in the classroom. So when I first got somebody, it was Chamber of Commerce. A woman came to my neighborhood. She lived in the neighborhood. She came to my house and she said, look, when I was 18, we used to sit up late at night and talk about things that really matter, love and God and death, meaning and friendship. And now I'm 45 years old. When I get together with my friends, we just talk about what are the kids doing, what's on sale at the mall, who's Notre Dame playing this weekend. She said, we're awash in triviality. Could you come to the Chamber of Commerce? We're having a gathering of young business leaders in the community. Could you come and philosophize with us to give us an excuse to talk about important things again? And I said to this woman, God, Linda, you're so smart. I mean, Socrates thought about the least important things we think about and talk about the most important things we think about and talk about the least. We upside down and inside out. We need to turn this around. So I said, sure. She said, well, we want you to give a talk on the ethics of decision making. And anybody else would have probably said, well, I'm not the ethics guy. You need to call this guy instead. But I said, okay, I'll come up with something. And that led to sort of launching me into this whole world I had never anticipated being a part of. My Christian faith, as a young kid growing up in a Baptist church, I ended up leaving at about 13 or 14 when I was first really active in bands, because my Baptist church did not believe in rock music or in dancing, and that was bad for my business, So when my dad asked me, my father asked me, why don't you go to church anymore? And I said, the church is, I didn't say, it's bad for business. I said, the church is full of hypocrites. And you know what he said to me? He said, can you think of a better place for them to be? And I had to think about that one for a while, right? That was a good answer. And so I kind of drifted away until I got to Chapel Hill and big campus Christian groups. Now, this was 1970 when the 60s really happened. And there were big Jesus groups, one-way T-shirts, all these groups, Campus Crusade, InterVarsity, all these other groups, and they all needed a guitar player. Well, I was a guitar player. So it wasn't theology. It was just, hey, I get to be in front of a crowd again. All right, good,
Yeah.
So that got me into philosophy of religion again. I rediscovered the deep issues of the Christian faith and of theism. And that got me to graduate school. I did philosophical theology, philosophy of religion, thinking I was going to do that the rest of my life. But then business groups, after the chamber, everybody's bank, real estate company, Rotary Club, Kiwanis, they all, and pretty soon I was traveling all over the world giving talks about whatever people were interested in, not the stuff I studied at Yale, but I learned that it's really not about me and what I'm interested in. It's about what difference I can make for people with what they're interested in. What problems people face out in the world of work and life that I, as a philosopher, can help them think better about. And so I've been like 1,200 talks. I've had rooms of up to 10,000 people in a room. It's been to launch my first non-academic book on the #1 talk show at the time, Live with Regis and Kathy Lee. And then my next book, A Show, it was like being shot out of a cannon with respect to public attention. So, ever since I've been sailing those winds, just trying to make a difference for people. And when people come to me with new topics like, can you help us? Have you ever thought about disruptive change? Have you ever given a talk on that? No, I never have. We've got a real problem with that in our company. Could you put together something for us? Okay. So that ends up becoming my book, Plato's Lemonade Stand. When life ends up lemonade, everybody says it. Nobody says how. The philosophers said an awful lot about how to be transformative with the difficult things that come our way. And just recently, I turned in a manuscript on uncertainty, because for the past year and a half, people have been calling me not about disruptive change, but about uncertainty. So to become a philosopher is something I never intended, but I just learned to say, okay, I'll look into it. And, saying yes to things that I wasn't prepared to do, that's kind of made my life so much more interesting.
That's amazing. But Tom, so one of the things that your story makes me think about is I had a colleague once, and I'll stick up a link to your Plato's Lemonade Stand, folks are interested. I once was thinking with a colleague, and I was like, I am torn between the importance of what we might call public philosophy or public intellectual work. And on the other hand, very few people in the world have the kind of guild stamp of approval to do things at such a high level in such expert ways. And those are needed in order to, trickle down and then be culturally transformative, right? That, my analogy when I think about these things is like, I am very glad that the people who, discovered and worked on polio vaccines and, COVID vaccines and measles and all these kinds of vaccines, that they weren't just out giving talks about the importance of vaccinations. They were actually making drug combinations that then killed stuff so that we could live more, longer lives, right?
Absolutely.
So the response I got from this colleague was, I think you've got a false dichotomy. Yeah. All intellectual work is public work. The question is, which public are you addressing? Right? And that was a fascinating thing for me to think about. There are different publics. Yes. Right. There's the public of the guild. There's the public of my students when I stand in the classroom. There's the public at Theology Beer Camp when I'm speaking there, which is a very different audience than when I speak and give an academic lecture to the Soren Kierkegaard Society, which is a very different public than when I wrote Camping with Kierkegaard as kind of an existentialism for the masses. All of us are wrestling with finding meaning in middle age. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you find different publics to be do you find different publics to speak to who you are, or do you actually see a academic philosopher, public philosopher as a kind of dichotomy we should think about as a rigid distinction?
It's interesting because I wrote my first 10 books with Oxford Press and Cornell Press and stuff like that. I wrote an article. So when I was first hired, somebody said to me, by the time you retire, try to get one article in the Philosophical Review that will make your career.
Well, and for those who do not know, that's a big deal, right? Yeah, Phil Review is like, that's swinging for the fences.
So I was very lucky. My third year as an assistant professor, I got an article in Philosophical Review. So it was like, okay, they can't let me go now, but I was at the American Philosophical Association in Boston or someplace, New York. And a well-known philosopher came up to me and he said, "Hey, congratulations on your article in Phil Review. It's so impressive." I said, "Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it." He said, "I tried to read it and it gave me a massive headache." And I was discovering new modalities of property exemplification other than necessity and contingency. And I was hanging on by my own fingernails as I spelunked through the different possible ways to have a property that you could have begun to have, but you can't cease to have it, or you can't cease to have it, but you could have begun, and all these different. And so I thought, am I going to spend my whole career writing things that 37 people in the world will read and massive headaches? I didn't. So I wrote a book. I did a seminar for the National Endowment for the Humanities for 8 summers for the best school teachers in America, K through 12. They bring 15 of them to live with me at Notre Dame for a month, and we read Pascal together, Pascal's Pensées. And so I wrote up that seminar as a book called Faith. What is it called? Making Sense of It All. Pascal and the Meaning of Life. And that was the first book I wrote the way I talk. I told funny stories about my kids. I told funny stories about my neighbors, and all in grappling with the ultimate issues. And I said, okay, this is the way I want to do things from now on. And so that led to True Success and If Aristotle Ran General Motors and all the other books that started getting public attention. I never stopped being an academic in the sense that I try to bring the best of my analytical abilities, my conceptual talents, discernment. There are people on LinkedIn who are pretty famous business advisors who post memes about leadership and business, and almost everyone they post is literally false. I mean, it's sort of in the neighborhood of a truth. It'll always be catchy, but it will hardly ever be exactly true. And I think, okay, that's what it means to be an intellectual. You care about truth, even when it's an elusive quarry. You're going to do your best not to mislead people and give them counterfeit wisdom just because it sells. You want to help people grapple with the real issues in real ways. And that's what we wanted to do as academics as well. When you're at the Kierkegaard Society, that's what you want to do. Kristin, when you're talking to theologians, and that's what they want to do. We're not just in the bumper sticker culture. We want to give people something deeper, more lasting, more useful than that.
Yeah. Well, I, Aaron, sorry, I'm so excited now what Tom is saying, because I don't know about either of you, but it's so funny. Like you say, you see this on LinkedIn, Tom. I feel like now we're in this age where you have so many people, especially on like TikTok and Instagram, who are so assertive as I've got the truth. Here's this new idea. And a lot of it very tinged, if not saturated with cynicism. I feel like there's a lot of that you see. And whether it's about psychology, and mental illness, or it's about things to do with business or all these trends, it's hard, I think, especially for young people to kind of sift through and see what is true. And so I'm wondering, obviously you've had experience with this, but I wonder what both of you think about this kind of turn now where there's so much information, but not a lot of, I almost want to say like truth literacy or knowing how to digest it.
That's fascinating. I think so actually I'll start toward an answer by asking you a question, Kristin. You exist more effectively than I do in what I would describe as the space of sort of influencer culture, right? And in fact, part of, and I say this as a compliment, part of your consulting work is kind of helping people, fix their brand, present themselves in ways that can be, traction garnering. One of the things that has been, I think, the most difficult for me to navigate in the last 4 or 5 years or so that I've really fully embraced doing public philosophy as my primary mode of engagement, right? And then kind of on the side, I'm still publishing a lot of academic stuff. The hardest thing for me has been the fact that influencer culture, and again, here I'm probably speaking too vaguely, but it's your brand often is, here's the thing that you come to me to find out because I've got this figured out and I can package this for you in ways that are consumable. Right. And when you've got somebody like me, who's, I'm a quote unquote specialist in postmodern philosophy of religion and existential phenomenology. The big things that we have figured out are the radical importance of perspectival epistemology and the fact that you probably can't occupy a God's eye view on much of anything. And what does confidence look like when you lack certainty? And how can we think about the radical importance of agency as not something, though, that is singularly located in any one sexy political framework, but actually as complicatedly intersectional in relationship to what we might call hermeneutic contexts, right? Now, notice, when I describe what I do, eyes glaze over as fast as Tom describing non-traditional modal ontology, right? So I have struggled with how do you brand or present the importance of, as you put it, like this training in truth, where truth doesn't mean have it all figured out, right? So how have you found ways to encourage people to find traction in these spaces where the way you get traction is either throwing cats off of roofs for YouTube or blowing up $1 million of fireworks in the next 5 seconds, Mr. Beast, right? But what if what you're doing is saying, hey, folks, come think with me about really hard stuff, and I don't have it all figured out, but I think thinking together about this is how we flourish as humans. This is how we make progress as a society. That's not sexy, right? That doesn't grab people in the same way. How have you made inroads into that?
Oh, this is such a big question. And I'm really interested at Tom's perspective too, after I say a few thoughts. But yeah, I will say, I don't know if anyone's really described me as an influencer before. I might be a micro influencer, but I don't have a large audience. And if you see like my personal channels, I don't post that much. And I actually took at some point, in my 20s, like years ago, I took a big step back from like Facebook because I spent a lot of time there, and it's tricky. I mean, something I talk about with my business partner a lot is to know a lot of the culture and what's going on. You kind of have to be plugged in, but then there's all the complications of being plugged in and being frankly addicted. Almost like everyone I know, I would say, is to a certain extent by the time we spend on our phones specifically. And I would say, well, first of all, there's no cut and dry answer, but a few of the things that I lend my, or I try to aim for. With first of all, with clients and with marketing in general and trying to reach the right audience, there is something about it's not always going to be for everyone, and knowing that, I don't know if Tom's he has a large audience, it sounds like, speaking to thousands of people. And I think there are certain topics, especially when it pertains to work, where so much of your life is influenced by your work setting, your happiness, well-being,
right.
your thriving. But for some of the things that we are helping with, it's very niche, and it says, how can we find the right people for this? And sometimes that's more for leaders, organizational leaders, or people in a position who are also sometimes Christian, which is a further niche, where it's like, okay, one of our clients works on kind of discourse and conflict transformation. Well, that's a pretty niche audience. And then there are people who need to reach faith leaders, and we're like, okay, well, we have ways to reach faith leaders. I think even, when we're discussing like podcasters, they have their topics that tend to go a certain way, even some of the people you mentioned earlier. But then when I think about kind of what's going on, and I even think about if I don't have kids now, but if I were to have kids, and the way the world is going, what matters and how do we really transform, and what has transformed me. And I think what's beautiful about grad school is sometimes it's actually knowing people and the real face-to-face connections. That is so much of what matters to me. I mean, it sounds like a lot of Tom's speaking engagements have been in big rooms, and the things that happen there, you just can't even plan a lot of the time. But then in your own communities, like I think about, we try and start a philosophy conversation. People sometimes get nervous because they don't really know what that means, and they don't know if their brain is robust enough for that. They have all these doubts. But if you have a book club, you're going to probably talk about philosophical ideas. You're probably going to talk about things that are meaningful to you. And, and I'm sure we're going to get into politics at some point here, or some aspects of it at least. People are really scared of that too. There's things that threaten their belonging. There's things that threaten their social security in terms of like actually engaging with other people face to face and just wanting to be accepted. And so I think, and I feel like you do this well, Aaron, is like living your philosophy is a big part of that. And so, it's still hard to answer that question, but I think that's the beginning of it for me.
Somebody, we've got around the campfire, I see all these comments. Thank you, everybody, for leaving comments. I see our good friend Phil Yanoff said about your question.
He's in there. He said, and everybody that's listening, wherever you're watching the live stream, if you drop comments there, it feeds into us. And so we are paying attention. That's right.
We're paying attention. I see Phil says, I think Aaron is asking, how do you get people to eat their vegetables? And I want to say something about that. That's a very good question, because when I was
if the answer is just add cheese, that always works. By the way.
Bacon, grease, and cheese usually have something to do with it, right? But I'm old enough. We started off speaking about my age. I'm old enough to remember people like William F. Buckley on television and the Dick Cavett show, when all these intellectuals would come on. Even Donahue, the kind of the early age of talk television, he would bring on great scientists and great novelists and psychologists and people doing serious work. The Today Show used to have people like me, with serious books. And then things started coming apart. Now, I remember as a graduate student reading the great book by Professor Hofstadter at Columbia called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And by the time you finish that book, you're just thankful there is such a thing as a college or a university or any intellectual life at all in America. And then there was Neil Postman's 1986 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. Then there was Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. A lot of the trends that we have seen since I was a child have militated against public intellectual discourse at any kind of serious level. It's funny, when I left Notre Dame, I was a full professor. I had a guaranteed job for life. My friends reminded me when they heard the news that I was leaving, just to be an independent philosopher, as if that's a thing. They kept reminding me, you're giving up 20 years of guaranteed income. How do you know that 6 months from now, anybody's going to invite you to, and pay you $1 to be a philosopher? I said, well, I don't, but I actually believe something that I've come to realize was false. but it gave me the confidence I needed. I would say to a couple of my neighbors, I said, you know what? People pay for two things. People pay for what they want, and people pay for what they need. Everybody needs wisdom. Everybody needs philosophy. So I got nothing to worry about. Well, here's where I went wrong. People do pay for what they want, but they don't pay for what they need. They pay for what they believe they need. They may need philosophy. They may need wisdom, but unless there is a version of pre-evangelism to convince them they need wisdom and philosophy, they're not going to come asking for wisdom and philosophy. So I realized early on that I had to find the cheese. I had to find the bacon grease. I had to find, okay, what's going to make people listen to the serious stuff? And to just give you an idea how this works, I did a book a couple of years ago. The old television producer, Norman Lear, we became friends when I was 39 and he was 69. We were friends for 32 years, and he would call me with all these interesting ideas. Tom, you need to do this, and I'd go to visited him in his vacation house at his big house in Bel Air. He was a big fan of public philosophy. And when I was a young guy just doing this for the first time, he was kind of pushing me, get out there and do this stuff, And so just happens also to be convenient on my desk, the Everyday Patriot, How to Be a Great American Now. He asked me to reread the Declaration of Independence as an adult and to write a book about patriotism that takes people back to the original meaning, back to Aristotle, back to the Stoic philosophers, back to who our founders read. And so I mentioned that book only because, who knows, somebody who's watching tonight may buy a copy, but I also mentioned it because I was asked 2 weeks ago to give my first speech on that book. The book came out 2 years ago. It was the first time I was ever asked to give a talk. It was for a weekend of people that were AI founders, astrophysicists. One guy just won the Nobel Prize in astrophysics not too long ago. There were company founders, there were presidents, there were deans of graduate schools, there were all kinds of people. And here I was in front of 300 people, very demanding audience. And even though they were all intellectuals in various ways, I started off with the most humor I've ever used with a group of people because I wanted them to listen to Aristotle from the politics. I wanted them to listen to Heroic. I wanted them to listen to some things from Plato's Republic, but I knew I had to tease. I knew I had to have the secret sauce. So
that's right.
Laughing, know it. They're learning some philosophy. So if I even, while I'm in a group of, with a room of intellectuals, I'm in a generally public space, they've got to have a place to have this idea that you've got the most possible from the teacher. Well, I don't know if you, but you have to experience of learning. So you've got, and it could be right, Neil Postman's idea, we're entertaining ourselves to death. It could be that that's a problem for our culture, but as long as it's on everybody's attention list. See, how do we get people to engage? How do we get people to attend to important ideas? We have to touch them where they are. It's almost like a bridge that we have to be willing to cross almost all the way on the bridge to help them come at least halfway back in our direction. And I did it as a professor, and I do it now as a public philosopher. And so people who may have been told we got a philosopher as our keynote speaker today was like, oh no. The Washington Speakers Bureau package fee with Colin Powell and General Schwarzkopf and Barbara Bush and Daddy Bush and Carville and Matlin. I was the who's he amongst the who's who. I was the only person on the program I'd never heard of. And when people heard that the Washington Speakers wanted to sell me as one of the keynote speakers, they would say, no, not a philosopher. That's not going to work. No. And then they badger them enough. They finally hire me. And they said once when I was there at the Washington Speakers Bureau, now this is about being a public intellectual. They said to me, Tom, of all the speakers we've ever worked with, you're the hardest to initially sell, and you're the easiest to resell. Because one company, for example, I did 69 talks for that company. And they said the reason is people have no idea what philosophy is. They have this distorted view that it's boring, it's old, it's irrelevant. And then when you explode onto the stage with hilarious stuff that reaches people where they live, then all of a sudden you've got them listening, and you hold that attention through real ideas that they can use the very next day in their work. So we have a job to do. when we venture into public. I mean, Socrates just needed more jokes. Otherwise, when people buy you a drink, you have to be very careful. So yeah, that's my experience, and it goes on to this very day. When people hear I'm going to show up, it's like, a philosopher. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
I was taken to Costa Rica with 8 company presidents on their private jet, and the guy who invited me, who ended up being ambassador to Switzerland, he said to me, "Tom, 3 of the guys say this is the stupidest thing I ever heard of, dragging a philosopher down to the jungles in Costa Rica. Why are we taking a philosopher? What were you thinking?" And at the end of our week together, 3 guys came up to me and hugged me and wouldn't let go. And the ambassador said to me, those were the 3 guys. So
oh my goodness,
people have a bad idea about the intellectual life. People have a skewed idea about philosophy, about theology, about serious deliberation on issues that matter. But when we can show them that these things can not only be fun. I used to tell my graduate students, philosophy is serious, but it doesn't mean it has to be somber. So we can have great fun in these things, and we also show them the practical applications of getting your bearings with some of these big ideas. Then vistas open up for people, and they want more.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So we're going to take a quick break and hear from our sponsor, but I'm going to prime the pump and ask you both to think about, what do you see as some of the biggest obstacles to getting, a broader public interested in the kind of thinking that you do? So Kristin, this thinking about theology, about ethics, about social discourse. Tom, thinking about, flourishing and a philosophical conception of success and how we become socially active. What are the obstacles that we've got to think about and name in order to overcome? And we're going to talk about that when we get right back. We're going to hear from our sponsor, Planksip.
I hope you are enjoying Campfire Philosophy. I would like to take a moment to thank Planksip for sponsoring the show. Daniel Sanderson is the guy behind that media outlet, and he is a fellow lover of philosophy. So if you get a chance, head over to planksip.org. That's PLANKSIP.org. If you sign up for their ideal plan and use the offer code AARON, that's AARON, you will get 50% off for the first 6 months. Free book publishing and lots more. Go check them out. And thanks so much to Daniel and Planksip for sponsoring Campfire Philosophy. Now, back to the show.
Awesome.
Yeah, it turns out Planksip is doing in real time the stuff we're talking about. It's amazing what Dan Sanderson and them over there at Planksip are up to. They're really, really doing amazing work. I am on their newsletter personally, and so I get almost daily new essays that have been written, and they partner with amazing thinkers who may not know how to access public audiences. And Planksip is doing a fantastic job of getting folks in front of people that need to hear their ideas, and then working with them to craft those ideas in ways that can actually reach those audiences. So definitely, everybody check out planksip.org. And again, you can use the code CAMPING or the code AARON for 50% off. So thank you so much to Dan. We're honored to work with him and to have him as a sponsor of Campfire Philosophy with AARON.
Sounds great.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is, I give 2. My 2 biggest obstacles, I think, and these are not in isolation. They nest. I think often when you talk about obstacles to flourishing, you're going to talk about Russian nesting dolls, where if this is the thing we've got to fix, it turns out that thing is anchored in 7 other things. But 2 that I have been thinking a lot about, and Phil Yanov actually mentioned one of these, is recently I've been in my own philosophy classes reading the work of Harry Frankfurt and his work on bullshit. Yeah. And then also the work of my friend Aaron James, who is going to be doing a later episode of Campfire Philosophy later in the season. I'm going to have Aaron James and Nick Riggle come together, and we're going to talk about what it means to camp, surf, and skate through life with, the 3 of us having written books on kind of these different activities. And so Aaron has this book called Assholes. So assholes and bullshit, it turns out, I think, are 2 of the biggest obstacles. And I apologize to my mother, who is probably watching. She keeps saying, Aaron, I love your work. Why do you have to use those terms? And as I say to my son, you're allowed to cuss in my family as long as you give footnotes, right? You've got to cite your sources. It's like, yeah, that's just bullshit. And I was like, yeah. He's like, Frankfurt's conception. All right.
Frankfurt. Oh my goodness.
But in brief, right, Frankfurt's idea of bullshit is people talk about stuff that they don't actually understand.
Right.
And this leads them to a position where they're not actually interested in truth telling, nor importantly, are they even interested in lying. They're just interested in trying to motivate a particular kind of response from the audience, get people excited, get them following, get them active, motivated to do what you're asking them to do. And so he says, when you have a world run by PR, politics, and the press, you are likely to have bullshit on the rise, right? Yeah. And interestingly, he says bullshit is way more dangerous than lying, because liars have to care about the truth in order to deceive you away from it. Right?
Yeah.
Bullshit, it's not just that you're ethically vicious because you are deceptive, like the liar. You are epistemically vicious because you are actively non-conscientious about the expectations of reason giving as a requirement of social life. Right.
Yeah, you don't even care.
So
you don't even care.
You don't even care. You're not even trying. Right.
Yeah.
And so bullshit couples with the asshole culture from Aaron James. And he says an asshole is the person who has three conditions. The person who claims particular privileges as a result of systematic entitlement that immunizes them from critique. And so when you think about, wow, this is what echo chambers cultivate. This is what only being surrounded by people who say yes to each other and then get mad at anybody who disagrees as being irrational. You cultivate the rise of assholery because we start thinking, well, I get these privileges because I'm just better than those fools, right? And traditionally, assholes have been very discreet, like individuals. Right. You can point to this or that person as kind of the notorious asshole, right? You know, the Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or, you know, whoever the case may be. But today, and this is my view, assholery has begun to become at the root of a particular kind of group polarization, where we begin to think my group gets special privileges because we are the ones entitled to it by knowing the way things really are. And we are immunized from critique because anybody who disagrees with us, well, they're irrational or immoral. So you have a kind of group assholery coupled with bullshit, because if they were really invested in truth, they would actively seek out objections and critiques to their own views, but they're insulating themselves from those criticisms, right? And so then when you show up as a philosopher and you're like, wait, I agree with you all on issue X, but man, I really disagree with the way we are holding issue X as a public display. We are bad at democracy. We are bad at critical thinking, even if we're right about the particular view that we articulate, right? And when you make that sort of nuanced move, what I keep running into is a wall of, you're not really one of us, you're not really committed, you're a traitor, you're really on the other side, you're not an advocate, right? All these sorts of things, because it's like, no, you're poking holes in the narrative of our privilege and systemic entitlement, even if, and this is complicated, but even if all of that is a result of narrating a particular kind of historical injustice and marginalization as the ground of that group identity, right? And so I'll give you the example that is less controversial. Like when it comes to deconstructive Christian communities, who I am deeply sympathetic with and speak to and identify with when it comes to actual views that are being held, I think an awful lot of it is a kind of mutual reinforcing of why those people are dangerous and bad and awful. And we're the smart ones who get it and they're so stupid, right? And I don't think the leaders of the groups are necessarily doing that, but I think there's an easy mode in which that can start happening. And if you say, well, wait a minute, let's be better than this. That was like, oh, but you're not actively affirming the reality of my struggle or what I've experienced. And you're like, no. I can't affirm that other than to say it's not my experience. And I'm so want to hear about yours. And yes, the systems are a mess and power structures suck and it's creating injustice and that's awful. Trauma is real. But that doesn't license us to be bad thinkers about what it is we now agree on, right? We still have to show critical engagement. So those are my two initial stabs at part of why public intellectual work is so desperately needed and so desperately difficult is because bullshit and assholery have become group models, not just individual practices. What do you guys think about other options?
I wish I could slip him a long list of vulgar and scatological words just to hear him work them into a philosophical conversation.
Well, I do, Tom. I should say, sometimes so Kierkegaard has this line where he says, there are only two types of people in the world, those who bore themselves and those who bore others. And he says it's way more important not to be boring to yourself. And so I've started in my classes, I'll go in and like, we'll do Mad Libs for my lectures. Oh. And so I'll go in and say, all right, somebody, I want 5 words you do not think there is any way I can legitimately deploy in today's class.
No way.
And we'll write them on the board. And then in the course of the lecture, I have to work them into the lecture seamlessly and not in a kind of trivial way. It makes the lectures way more exciting to me.
Yeah, there you go. That's the drummer. That's the jazz influence.
Yeah, improv. Yeah, you know. All right, how can I get Paris and Twinkle into today's lecture? Yeah, way more fun.
Oh my goodness.
So, Kristin, I would throw that to you though. What do you see as obstacles, difficulties that we've got to wrestle with in order to get better at this training in truth, which is such a nice phrase that you said earlier?
Well, I was hoping you'd throw it to Tom, but you know, we'll hear what his many more years of wisdom will bring. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have adopted really, I guess, a simple view that, well, there's just, first of all, an onslaught of just things to pay attention to. Again, we're saying that, I loved what Tom said earlier. You have to go where people are. And I think there is that's happening with different like even philosophy podcasts and people who are going on these platforms to share things that are it's old knowledge. It's not something that they're just saying, I decided this, which is a lot of what you get. It's like, guess what? I read this book and I'll summarize it really quickly for you in case you're interested in checking it out. I'm like, that's great. And I will say I personally have even benefited from a lot of that. But I mean, there's so much of it on the psychological side in terms of what is rewarded in society. And there's just a lot to do with, I mean, I think there's a lot of things to do with like classism and just feeling superior. And so I think that's what we see, the assholery, as you're saying it.
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, maybe you adopt a view and you hold it legitimately, but then you hold it to just feel better than those who don't because you discovered it. And I feel like, I mean, I've seen that even in myself where I'm like, oh, I'll notice myself feel superior because I know I understand something, or even having a grad degree. You know, it's this thing. It's like, well, I read these big books. I took a hermeneutics class. You don't even know what that means. You know what I mean? Like it can be so dumb to just to be able to platform yourself in your own mind as like a superior person. And so I think there's a way that it's just like, I don't want to say we have to appeal to that. I want to say we have to show somehow that there's a better way. And that's something that I can't necessarily say, and we do that by blah, blah, blah. But Tom can, so here he goes. No.
Right.
You know, it's that old distinction made by information theorists between signal and noise. We live in a very noisy culture. And there are so many competing demands for people's attention. And there's so much counterfeit wisdom out there. Anything that people think they can make money from, anything that people think they can get attention for, they can get praise for. We have a lot of people entering the space of ideas who really have no training in handling ideas well and no desire to do that. I don't demand that somebody have a college degree or a graduate degree before they speak on philosophical topics, but I want them to at least have done the hard work of trying to understand things aright before they start creating slogans and memes that just mislead people. There's so much of that. When the world is flooded with counterfeit money, I like to remind people there couldn't be counterfeit money unless there was real money. And that's the same thing with counterfeit wisdom. There couldn't be counterfeit wisdom unless the real thing was out there. That's really what people need. And sometimes that's what people want. But there is this predilection for the easy in our time. And that's in part a response to the overwhelming noise of being pulled in so many different directions, so many demands for your time. So give me something easy and quick because I don't have time for anything more than that. People are not going to go to a monastery for 3 years. People are not going to go. In fact, I met a guy, a remarkable guy, this couple weekends ago. A group said I was talking to about the Everyday Patriot. A guy came up to me and asked me to lunch. He was the director of the famous movie Hoop Dreams that traces kids from Chicago from elementary school into college, and they're dreaming to be basketball players.
Great movie.
A guy who's done a lot of films, but I mentioned him, Frederick Marx, because he's the rare person who has gone on silence retreats and meditation retreats and treks in the desert and done all the hard work to try to get beyond the chatter of his brain, the clutter of our culture, to get down to the silent spots, the empty places, to empty some of himself out so that he can be filled with real wisdom and truth. When I learned his story, I just said, man, you are such a distinctive character in our time, because nobody wants to go to any trouble for anything. Do you want the truth or do you want falsehood? Well, of course, everybody wants truth, but they want easy truth. And the easy part is more important than the truth part. And so you see a lot of people being content with counterfeit wisdom in our time. And we just have to blast through that. And how do you do it? Well, first of all, you try to unveil the falseness of the counterfeit. You try to show them where that stuff goes wrong. And then you show them the real thing and they go, whoa, really? So it's sheer exposure. In our time of noise, the signal gets through so seldom that people don't even know what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like. So that when they do come into contact with the real thing, my experience of doing this for 40 years now, with all these groups of 5,000 people and 10,000 people, and to have people write me weeks later, years later, and say, the ideas you talked about are still with me. And I just think to myself, wow, that's because I'm not just making up stuff that sounds good. I'm depending on deep wisdom traditions and ideas that have stood the test of time, to put it simply, right? And so they have a ring of truth about them when people hear them, but people don't get to hear them because they're listening to all the other stuff all too often. So when we're just brave enough to go out there, when we have the courage to spark people's curiosity, then we see things happen. But it does take courage, because we don't often enter the public sphere with T-shirt slogans, with bumper stickers to sell to people. And that's what they're accustomed to. So we have to be brave enough to introduce them to the real thing, and then it shines through for more people than we would have imagined.
So I start pretty much every class that I teach, I start with David Foster Wallace's This Is Water. It's a small little, now published as a book, but it was a commencement address that he gave at Kenyon College. And I start with that book in all my classes, because what he does there is, as you alluded to earlier, Tom, is the hard stuff we don't talk about. The easy stuff occupies all our attention. And so what he does is, starts with he puts it a didactic little story of the two young fish swimming along, and the old fish swims along and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they look at each other and say, "What the hell's water?" Right. And he goes on to say, the stuff that we consider obvious is almost always not, right? It's actually where we begin to put question marks, where everybody else has assumed there are just periods. It's those moments where real insight can occur. And he goes on to then say, part of the problem with living a life defined by periods we've inherited from others is that we never come to realize that we've lived our life according to default settings that were always contingent, but we received them as necessary, obvious, and we do this under the guise of a narrative of the real world. Right. That's just the way the world is, right?
Yeah.
And so something that I always tell my students, and then I'm going to offer this as another obstacle, I think, is that the academy, the university has failed us. And I'm going to say why and see what you guys think about this. So he goes on to say that, part of the problem is when we assume things as necessary that are really contingent, we then refuse to see possibilities where everyone else sees just, exclamation points, right? And so part of what I think the universities have done is they have exacerbated that narrative of the real world as a inherited necessity that cannot be otherwise. And they do this under the guise of ostensibly a commitment to something you talk a lot about, Tom, success. But what they mean by success is not this philosophical idea that you present in your work. They mean by it, hey, people with the most stuff, with the easiest access route to fame, with the external accomplishments, the boxes being checked, that's the goal. And those are the people who then give more back to the university as alums. They're the people we invite to come give the commencement addresses. They're the ones who endow the wings of the new entrepreneurial school so that we can create a whole generation that prizes what those people have cherished as their value theory. We now name that as obviously what is to be valued.
Yeah.
And of course, the problem is, the university is a space to say, hey, as Aristotle puts it, we've got to figure out really well what's worthy of desire.
Yeah.
But if they walk in at 18 already thinking that they and their parents have got the desire part figured out, and we are just the, one-stop shopping mega mart for how to then get the, off-ramp to success.
Yeah.
I think that what we've done is actively created we might say, college-educated populace that is real dumb, right? Because they can talk sophisticatedly about things, but they can't interrogate their own assumptions about what things are worthy of talking about, right? And that, to me, is where an awful lot of, like I say, in my recent book, Camping with Kierkegaard, the foil to what I'm advocating, this kind of existentially aware, reflective, purposive life, is the person who thinks success will give my life meaning. When in fact, all it's probably going to do is give you fancy cars or fancy guitars or whatever the thing is. And you'll still likely be empty looking for that tried and true classical wisdom stuff. But that's not usually found in box checking, right? It's not usually found in awards and accolades. It's in what the ancient Greeks called, this real sense of ataraxia, of finding fulfillment and peace on the other side of aporia, where aporia is this perplexity and confusion and wrestling with, I just don't know. And so, Kristin, when you say we're kind of all convinced we've got this stuff figured out, we never hit aporia, which means we've got to mistake ataraxia, true fulfillment, for just this kind of cheap grace, as Bonhoeffer would call it, the cheap grace of external achievement and accomplishment, right? So I think universities are complicit in the lack of public aptitudes for truth-seeking, because they've actively taught their students truth is way less compelling than bullshit if it gets you paid, right? So there's my critique. Kristin, what do you think? 'Cause I know you are recently in grad school. You're now out doing amazing things. But did grad school help or hurt in some of those ways as you were navigating these big questions?
Well, I feel like Tom had a great idea just at the forefront there. Did you sure you don't want to hop in first, Tom?
Well, all I wanted to say, it's an amazing podcast when you can go from assholes to aporia and ataraxia in 5 minutes. I mean, It's hats off to Aaron.
Well, and all of it is, of course, just trying to figure out how to sprinkle the right amount of cheese on our vegetables for our buddy Phil.
The campfire popped and crackled when you got to those, man.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I have to say to both of you, you're making me miss school, which was so, I'm like, oh yeah, I used to use these words more often, or hear them. And I mean, that's even something I'll say. I like, since grad school, I've not read nearly as much as I did, nor as much as it's funny. This is a whole other topic. I say as much as I want to, but if I wanted to, I think I would do it. So anyway, complications there.
Augustine's coming is like the haunting you. You can see Saint Augustine saying, "Oh, what you love forms your identity, Kristin."
I know. Oh my goodness.
At least you want to. You want to.
Yeah.
You've got second order wants there that are really fun.
Trying out here, but
you are meta virtuous, I think is what the point is, right?
That's all I want, on my tombstone. Really, she was meta virtuous.
She was meta virtuous. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've really got so many thoughts that are just spinning out from that. I think that there's a reward for certainty. That's what I see with people I know, and
that's smart. Yep.
Where especially when you have to sell yourself for a job and you have to sell yourself, that's the whole conundrum. Something I actually was going to say earlier as another obstacle for people getting interested is that they are worried about money and about their livelihood. And so many people I know, it's like, well, why would I go read about philosophy when I don't even know, if I'm going to have enough money to like figure out my life and have any sort of house someday. So all these they feel like more pressing concerns. And I think that weaving that in, like something that is kind of one of the popular ideas that stems to the top of certain social feeds, but have been talked about at length in different communities, and I'll say especially Christian communities, is one of the ways that people can address one of the challenging issues of how do I live? How do I have a place to live where I can have a livelihood? Is that you could have a communal living situation. But in the society we live in now, where there's this hyper individualism, especially in the West more than other countries, where you're discouraged from living with your parents, shamed actually for living with your parents at certain points, or with other people, to admit a certain level of need. If you were to sit back and say, hey, we can collectively, I'm sounding very, anti-capitalist here, but collectively get together and like pool our resources, there's ways you can actually solve problems. But that's not, even taking the time to talk about that as an option is hard. I don't even think people would know how to enter that conversation. I joke about it with my friends, but that's usually where it ends. Where I'm like, let's get our commune one day. So I guess, and that's where we need spaces to discuss ideas. I know I'm like just kind of sprinkling some things in, but I don't see that as people feeling, younger people especially, feeling that they even have an option or an outlet outside of internet forums to discuss these things. And then the information they're getting is monodirectional. Like something I think about now, the fact that I can talk with you and actually I am engaged to the point where I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have to say a response or ask a question. It brings me in a way that's so different from just consuming. If I were just listening, and not that that's bad, it's such a gift that we have all this information, but people don't even have the luxury of having a single person with which to have a philosophical conversation. So that's part of I think the added complications. I actually forget the original question. My apologies.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. I think that it's important not to miss the so it is very easy for philosophers to think that rhetorical gestures are world shaping without a lot of qualifiers, right? And it's important to understand that when I say like these narratives of the real world can be disastrous, they can be obstacles, they can shut down thinking, they can lock us in narratives of, inevitability and necessity, rather than realizing, man, like if we really grasp the contingency, we could do this different, right? And yet, I am not unaware that I say that as somebody who can spend an hour and a half thinking with the world's greatest minds about the world's greatest problems, because I also am a full tenured professor who, as Tom said earlier, has, at least in scare quotes, a job for life. Now it's scare quoted because I live in a right to work state, and tenure doesn't mean the same stuff here. And, there are some asterisks, but the privilege is really, really thick. And when I talk about in Camping with Kierkegaard, the importance of finding stuff that you think is worthy of your finitude and then figuring out ways to live into that and embrace that. Well, for me, that's stuff like not only being with my family and spending time with my father, who's, getting older. It's also stuff like getting on a mountain bike and standing in rivers, catching trout. But I can do that because I'm not 24, still in grad school, desperately having to put in 90 hours a week to maybe get that article at Review of Metaphysics, right? Like or Phil Review, that's the one it was. So finding ways to realize that there are real pressing circumstances not of our choosing that impact the set of decisions we can navigate. That's just being epistemically aware and responsible.
Yeah.
Right. If I only go fishing and never go teach my classes, I will lose my house. Like that's not it's a fiction of the real world. Nope. Like that's a reality of bankers and the way debt functions in our society. And we could maybe do it differently. We could rethink these things, as my buddy Aaron James is trying to do in his new book about money for nothing. But being able to do that work, thinking these things through, tragically, this is sort of the thesis of all of the rambling. Tragically, one of the great injustices of our contemporary world that does not get enough attention, right? Because we talk a lot about injustice and a lot about the importance of focusing on marginalized and oppressed communities, which I fully support. But we don't talk enough about the injustice of shutting down the genuine possibilities of making the world different if we created spaces for people to find voices, right? Like part of why I support overcoming historical injustice and marginalization is because I think, man, I need to learn and listen to people whose experiences don't look like my own. I probably am cognitively blind to all kinds of stuff that would be transformed if I could just have the opportunity to sit and think with people who have different backgrounds, right? But the problem is, because of injustice, we have silenced those voices and then created a second layer of oppression internal to the fact that the people who get to sit in, coffee shops and bars, drinking fancy things, talking about great ideas, tend to be the people who have got their mortgages covered and their healthcare taken care of, right? And so somehow recognizing, the way I'd put it is, existential reflection will always open onto works of justice. There cannot be one without the other. And that's where I think we need public intellectuals to make that case, right?
Right. It's not as if we're trying to burden everybody with one more thing that they don't have time to do.
Right.
It's like, okay, everybody has a busy life. We're not telling you to go get a copy of Plato's Republic and make time to read it necessarily. We're not trying to get you to think about a lot of things that you don't have time to think about. We're hoping to make your thinking that you already do better. And we're, as Epictetus thought, philosophy is a liberation. We mean to give you means of liberation from the things that oppress you already. We're not trying to oppress you with something more, something else. And when you look at philosophy that way, I remember as a graduate student, I went back to visit my undergraduate department at Chapel Hill, and I saw somebody had a photograph on a bulletin board of a guy at a construction site leaning up against a chain link fence with his black metal lunchbox open and his thermos out. He's eating a sandwich and he's reading Being and Nothingness on his lunch break from construction. I said to myself, that's my dream. I don't want to turn everybody into philosophy professors. I want to help people be more philosophical about their lives so that so much of their time isn't taken up by the trivial urgencies that really don't matter, how they can free themselves from all of that and have time for the things that do matter. That's what public intellectuals at their best are trying to do for people, or else they're just perpetrating another kind of oppression. And if we can do it right, it's to the benefit of everybody, including ourselves.
I think that's right. I think it's right.
So I'm curious to both of you, as more established and more trained, but just, you've got platforms and people you're seeing more regularly. What are some of those starting places that you're like, if someone wants to start implementing philosophy, recognizing how they could think differently than what they're focused on and maybe the immediate, what are some starting steps that you're like, okay, this is just a snippet of what you can change?
They can buy Aaron's book, Camping with Kierkegaard.
Hey!
Read it at lunchtime next to their metal lunchbox.
Tom, do you have a book too? What?
I have a couple of books.
There might be a few from Tom. Yeah.
Just a few.
I actually think it's such a good question, Kristin. I will say my answer to it is what I tell my own students, right? And so this is, and it's also what I say when I get asked versions of this question in public and at community groups or businesses or whatever it is. And it actually goes back to that David Foster Wallace idea. It's start putting question marks where you normally insert periods. And if you get good at this, sometimes you'll start realizing that's a darn good reading why that's a period. Like you know what? I probably shouldn't mess with that one. Like sometimes you'll now have better reasons for why you do what you do, and you'll realize it actually is a smart thing to do. But there will be these moments where you'll realize, oh, you mean I have both way more agency than I tend to recognize, and B, I am already somebody who can be a change agent in my sphere of influence, because it turns out almost everyone that surrounds us, that we interact with on a daily basis, almost all of them are desperately craving someone to let them know that they could put a question mark somewhere, right? Like it's a contagious awareness.
It is. And this is an important point. Don't think that what we're recommending is meant to be a solo venture. I think the buddy system makes it work the best. Find a friend who's also interested in these things, a friend that you can have conversations with, and then it can spread. I've mentioned to Aaron before, a few years ago during the pandemic, I reread the Odyssey 4 times in 1 year in 3 different translations. And I reread the Iliad twice that year. And I realized the Odyssey is about the power of purpose. The Iliad is about the power of partnership. When you have a sense of purpose in your life to deepen yourself, find a partner, find a buddy. Don't go in the water alone, right? Whether it's in the gym or whether it's doing philosophy about your life, get somebody you can talk with about it and share these ideas with. Don't try to go it alone.
Yeah. And that can look weird. So I once had a student, he was a little bit older, as a non-traditional student, who was working for a company, and we were talking about this question marks. Everybody puts a period, be a public philosopher, blah, blah, blah. Philosophy is not about getting a PhD. It's about being reflective and intentional wherever you find yourself, like doing the shtick that I actually do, right, all the time. And this guy comes up to me and he says, well, I'm going to take you seriously. Like, I think the place that I struggle most with, this is before COVID, this is before we rethought work hours and all these things. He said, I'm really frustrated because the company I work for does not need me in the office 40 hours a week. I can do my job in like 20 hours a week, and I could do it really effectively in different time. I could do it on weekends and evenings, and what I do doesn't need to look this way. And yet that's just the way it looks, which means I don't see my daughter. I don't hang out with my family. I never get a chance to, And he said, I'm actually going to go talk to my boss and say, why is it we do it this way? What if we did it this other? And I was like, man, be careful, right? Don't go in there thinking that you like make sure you're aware there's going to be some power structures and there's reasons we do things. And I said, but I think that's awesome. Let me know what he says. So he comes back and he said, Aaron, you'll never believe it. My boss listened to me and he said, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. Let's test it with you. So you now get the work done. I don't care how or when you do it. Get it done.
Wow.
And so my buddy started fishing. He started going to his daughter's, programs, all these different things. And it worked so well that the company changed their structure of work, like for everybody, because he was simply willing to say, what if we did this differently? Right. And that idea is a kind of, extreme version of what if you simply, and this is an example I get from Wendy Farley, and I don't actually know if she ever said this or if it was like the way I read what she was saying. So if Wendy is listening, she's like, I didn't say that. She inspired this thought. She says, sometimes all we need to remind ourselves that we are people of dignity is to let it be okay that we let our favorite song finish before we get out in the parking lot to go into our job. Right. And the idea that you have a partner who says, of course, that's fine. Or you have a boss that says, yes, like your meaning is not determined by being 2 minutes late one way or the other. Be on purpose, be good. Let's take what we do seriously, but not take ourselves seriously. Right. And so when you live that out, and notice I've not said anything about, I really do think you should go read Aristotle. Well, you should, but that's probably going to be a big ask. But you can live Aristotelianly simply by realizing there's a lot of ways to be, as he says at the beginning of Metaphysics. So why is it you think the only way that one could be is the way that you currently are? Right? It's like, you could do it different. Turns out there's Aristotle, right? So there's my suggestion. Let's put question marks and see what happens if you vocalize them and invite others to think with you about them. Yeah, find the buddy and then walk forward.
Yeah.
It's good. It's almost like the public intellectual is a purveyor of wise possibilities beyond the purview of most, and if we can open people up to the wiser possibilities for living that maybe haven't even occurred to them in various facets of their lives, we will have done our jobs.
And I think that is maybe, Kristin, because I love the way you put it, that we, was it celebrate or reward certainty, right? Like those are the people who get the big audiences. They get the prizes. And even I think about this, we said we talk about politics, so make sure we do here at the end. Like one of the things that bugs me most about politics in America today is the way that we act like democracy should reward certainty.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think that is a death nail to democratic polity. When we, like, can you imagine? I called publicly for Biden to withdraw. I'm glad he has. I think that was the right decision. But can you imagine a debate between Trump and whoever the Democratic nominee ends up being? It looks like it probably will be Harris. So let's say Harris and Trump are doing a debate. Can you imagine either of them saying, I think what the other person's saying here actually makes a lot of sense. Here's why I disagree with it. But my disagreement is not absolute. It's because I think that there's some issues that if we, I think it cuts this way. And the other person says, well, shoot, ultimately, we're not really disagreeing about the big issue. We're disagreeing about a particular debate that is 3 steps down the line that we actually can't even get to because of the way that the press moderators are asking the questions to force us into binaries that don't really exist. Like, can you imagine that debate, right?
See, I would nominate you to run for office just to hear the debate.
I was going to say, I just feel like I drank a cup of cold water. It was so refreshing, Aaron.
It's nuts, though, right? Because that debate would never happen. And there's reasons structurally why it won't, right? And those reasons are because that's not what we reward. That's not what we cheer. We function as people who need the applause to reinforce our own insularity.
See, Emerson really captured the American spirit of democracy when he said, all of life is experiment. And if we had that experimental idea about what we do, that not only is democracy itself an experiment that Plato had serious worries about, and so did a lot of other people in the ancient world. Aristotle was very concerned about it. But not only is it one big experiment, it's a big experiment composed of constant, ongoing small experiments. And when we don't have the curiosity of the experimental mindset, when we have the faux certainty instead, we block ourselves from the living flow that democracy is supposed to be. Democracy is supposed to be a heuristic, a discovery process, or how best to live well together, as Aristotle put it. And when we come up with all these false certainties to cut off off conversation rather than to initiate conversation, we're living in an anti-democratic way.
Yeah,
wow,
that's exactly right. And I actually think, Kristin, that this is why I love the title of your podcast, Petty and Prophetic, right? Because that is what democracy requires. We need both the prophetic mode of speaking truth to power, and we need to recognize the pettiness of often our own senses of truth and our own power, right? Like somehow we need both of these at the same time.
Well, credit where credit is due. Joel and Lucas, my co-hosts, they did name it, and they are. I mean, it's great. Because they're perfect. They're both youth pastors or have been a youth pastor, so they get that interaction with the young, which I think allows them not to take themselves too seriously and recognize, like, you can laugh, you can be silly, and sometimes that draws that attention in. I feel like what Tom was saying earlier, that experience of the classroom, I'm like, I think back to, even my own youth group or classes I've loved, and I'm like, it was so fun, I couldn't wait, and like they created that for us. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Really,
absolutely.
Really cool.
In fact, you mentioned this. It reminds me, I met a guy in February who was the most amazing guy in the AI space. He's a professor of computer science at University of Pittsburgh, and he has his own AI company. And he explained the way large language models and generative AI work to a room of people I was sitting in a way that nobody ever has. It finally made sense for the first time ever. And he was a youth pastor before he went into
my goodness,
the intricacies of artificial intelligence.
Wow. That's fantastic. Well, I can't tell you how cold water inducing or soul enthusiast. That's not I started down an enthuse to make it a verb, but it didn't work. It's soul enriching it is to think with people like the two of you about things that matter. I say on my Substack all the time, when I'm closing a post or whatever, I'll often say things like, it's important that we remember that we need to walk together and talk along the way. Right. And so for anybody who's interested, Philosophy in the Wild is my Substack. And that phrase, come, let's walk together and talk along the way, is what my wife and I said to each other in our wedding vows. And so we understood this kind of metaphor of going for a hike. We'll see what happens. We may or may not get to the overlook at the top. We might stub our toe. We might run into a snake. Like, stuff happens, but it's the idea that we keep moving together, that community that you talked about, Kristin, the partnership you talked about, Tom, in ways that also are animated and driven forward by the shared commitment to a relational truth. Right. I once had an epistemologist friend who said, Aaron, you care way too much about truth. If that's the only good, just read the phone book. Right. And so it's important to realize, like, what we mean by truth as being so important for society, for our deliberative engagement, for our democracies, is a relational truth. It's the idea that we are committed with each other to reason-giving interactions that can illuminate where we're wrong and can, invite a kind of confidence when we think the argument's cut in our favor. Like, that's part of what it means to walk together. And so you both walking with me tonight has been an absolute joy.
This was fun.
Yeah, seriously.
Well, before we go, I always want to remind the audience that when we sit by the campfire, we don't just talk philosophy. We sometimes have what my wife would see as much more important conversations. And so we're going to end by asking the 5 questions I ask of every guest and see where you guys stand on these before we close out our time together. So first, and the fact that Tom is coming straight from his beach house out in Wilmington, North Carolina, I think I know his answer. But which is the answer, beach or mountains? So Tom, beach or mountains?
Beach, but it's a hard choice, believe it or not.
Oh, that is interesting. All right. Kristin, beach or mountains?
Mountains. But when I lived in Vancouver, just outside Vancouver, BC, they would say, "Why not have both?" Because they really did.
Right.
That's fantastic.
But, mountains.
I would love to live. I'd love to live in the Pacific Northwest at some point just to experience what that is like. Because I have lived in Florida, and so I've lived near the beach, and I now live in the Carolinas, and so I live in the mountains. And I'm a mountains all the way down, because the beach always just seems to me like I used to work construction, paid my way through high school and college and stuff working construction. And so the beach is always for me like, why would I sweat and be sandy and pay for this? Like, I can just go lay sheetrock and feel the same way. So Pacific Northwest might be different though.
Yeah.
All right, number 2. As we sit by the campfire, whether at the beach or in the mountains, because you can do both, are you drinking hot chocolate, hot tea, or coffee? Kristin, start with you.
Oof, probably coffee. Okay. Maybe hot chocolate.
Maybe hot chocolate.
That's a good
I gotta go the same.
You're a coffee?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I am a tea aficionado, but as soon as I smell campfire smoke, I am a hot chocolate all the way down. In fact, one of my very good friends, James Bednar, he is a serious thru hiker. I mean, this guy backpacks in ways that I will never be good enough to do. And he and I went on a backpacking trip a couple years ago, and I brought my hot chocolate packets, for at the campfire that night. And I was like, dude, I've got some extra. Do you want a hot chocolate? And as we're drinking hot chocolate by campfire, he was like, oh my gosh, like this is the best thing ever. And I was like, well, he's like, I never think to bring hot chocolate. And it turns out there's something about the hot chocolate after a 20-mile day of hiking. I'm just there. All right, number 3. So when you're drinking your gross out vile bean that is coffee, what is your favorite campfire food? And it can't be s'mores. So other than s'mores, what are you eating with your coffee by the campfire, Tom?
Oh God, that's really tough. With my coffee. I mean, have I cooked bacon and eggs over the fire? Is that a possibility?
That's a possibility, and boy, it's a good one.
That better than the roasted hot dog, I think, with my coffee.
Yeah.
Now, if you snuck a Heineken in some ice, that might be different.
might shift it around. Well, I will say I am a breakfast by the campfire is hands down my favorite meal. As much as I love cooking dinner and stuff, because you've hiked all day and whatever, it's kind of a nice way to relax. Getting up in the morning, and I'm a fall through spring camper. Again, once it gets really hot, camping as much as I love it, and I'd always rather be sleeping in a tent. You like you're breathing soup when you live here in the Southeast, and so. For me, boy, a chilly morning, putting on your flannel and putting those that eggs and turkey bacon, no coffee. So I'm with you on that, Tom. That's a good option. I like that. All right, Kristin, what are you eating at the campfire?
Yeah, I feel like breakfast has usually been like the thing that I've had the most while camping, and like eggs and bacon / sausage for sure. But one time I went camping with someone who was like kind of a chef, and we had like this wonderful marinated chicken from the little camping grill. So I mean, that might have been a once in a lifetime opportunity, but that was very nice. That was
that's stepping up a game right there. Wow.
Clicquot on the side, I mean, champagne bottle.
Yeah, we had our glasses, the tablecloth. No.
Oh my goodness. Really that's serious. The fanciest stuff I ever make when I'm camping is always when I'm truck camping, just because obviously you can take big coolers and stuff. And so probably my favorite like truck camping meal is you can make some sort of like a peach cobbler or berry cobbler or something on the Dutch oven over the campfire. But again, there's no way you can do that backpacking, because carrying a cast
Dutch
iron
oven.
skillet with you is a bad idea. Turns out that
really
weighs more
strong
on its own than the whole pack. but man, is it good when you get it like crispy on the edges because of how, the heat there on the. Oh,
you're making me hungry. This is too late in the day to be making me hungry.
Go get some peach cobbler and coffee.
Yeah, right.
So, Tom, you noted that you are a musician. I am myself. Kristin, I actually don't know if you are a musician, but I can imagine that you listen to a lot of music because you hang out with people like Mason Meninga, who, of course, it went viral for jumping off of the stage for a Norma Jean concert. So, like, you hang out with musician types, whether or not you are. But I want to know, at the campfire, you've finished your breakfast or you've drinking your coffee at night, you've made your s'mores. What song do you want played, either by Tom with his guitar or with your Bluetooth speaker? Like what song? What's your campfire go-to song or genre or artist?
I want to make up stuff on a dulcimer, a mountain dulcimer.
Oh my goodness!
I love the sound of a mountain dulcimer, and I would want to just make up stuff on that. I bought a couple in Berea, Kentucky, and the guy there was telling me. He was kind of teaching me to play it the day I bought my first dulcimer. And he said it's an amazing the number of Beatles songs that you can play on a dulcimer, because a dulcimer is a very limited instrument, and yet you can do really beautiful things. So I would love to hear a dulcimer fill the air at the end of a beautiful
I like that. That's fantastic. That might be either so sophisticated, or it could be a little bit scary, kind of leaning toward the banjo music, right? It depends how you pull that off. But I think
I promise I won't play Deliverance on it.
No dueling banjos on the dulcimer. I appreciate that. All right, Kristin, what are you playing at the campfire?
Well, sadly, I'm not a musician as much as I would have loved to be in this lifetime, and maybe you never know. But I've always had music friends, and when they like just play a little thing that's so fun, and we'd sing, sometimes we'd like sing along and just make up songs or whatever. But in terms of just putting on an artist, it's probably Bon Iver, very woodsy feeling for me. Actually, with Dan Koch, he has his music podcast, and we did an episode on Bon Iver, because that was like that's one of my long time music loves, and just calm, but it just feels cozy. I mean, he wrote there's all the lore around the first album. He wrote it in a cabin, his father's hunting cabin. So anyway, that's my pick.
I love that answer. And for anybody, who doesn't know, Dan Koch has a bunch of amazing podcasts, but the one Kristin's referring to is called Pretty Good Vibrations. So you can check out her episode on Bon Iver, and you can check out my episode with Dan on Pretty Good Vibrations. Far more feisty, I am sure. Not Feist the band, the woman, but feisty in the sense of being spicy and controversial. He had me on because he overheard a conversation that I was having with Tim Whitaker about why I thought Blink-182 sucked with Tom DeLonge and was amazing with the lead singer coming over from Alkaline Trio. And so I defended that view. I don't think anyone who's ever listened to the episode thinks I'm right. But I gave it the best shot that I could, and absolutely will stick to my guns on that one. I think Blink-182 was better without Tom DeLonge. So check out Pretty Good Vibrations.
Aaron, if I could just add, in addition to playing a dulcimer, you asked what song. I would try to find out if there is a single song that you can play on the dulcimer that is really hated by bears and bobcats and mountain lions. And
that's
I would try
a good
to play
one.
that as loudly as I could. Yeah.
I hear, I may be wrong about this, but I hear Post Malone does not go well with bobcats. So a dulcimer Post Malone track might work out.
And all your other fellow campers are really going to love that too.
Yes, they're going to be thrilled. Hunna Band. They're going to love it. So yes, I think my answer now is anything by Matt Skiba from Alkaline Trio. I think that would be my answer currently, just because now I want to play it very loudly to annoy Dan at the adjacent campsite.
Yes, there we go.
So, yeah. All right, so final question. You could take one philosopher or theologian camping with you, alive or dead. Who do you take with you and why? Kristin,
Oh my
go
goodness.
first. Who do you take with you? Philosopher, theologian.
No.
Who do you take with you?
Ay. Wow. Well, I almost feel in a cheeky way I should just say Myron Penner. who was my advisor because
I didn't know you worked with Myron. Oh, that's hilarious. Okay.
Yeah.
Myron's a good mutual friend, yeah.
Yeah, he's hilarious, and he's also, I mean, he's in BC, so he knows outdoors, although he's more like a runner than anything.
Right.
It's funny. I almost want to go camping with Kierkegaard. I don't know.
Woo!
Almost want to
best answer ever. That's right.
Well, I do want to. I have not read enough Kierkegaard, and that's actually, I do want to read more. I think I just have works of love, and so
good place to start. If you got to go one place,
so maybe I will. I mean, maybe it's all happening. It's all happening for a reason, actually.
I like it. Well, actually, it's funny. Tim Whitaker and I have, in all seriousness, been bouncing ideas off each other about what would it look like to do some camping with Kierkegaard existential retreats, and to invite folks to join us in the mountains and like do different days with different philosophers, kind of a thing, and have these like like a 3-day existential themed trip to the mountains, which either sounds amazing or the nerdiest. Oh, you've got to be kidding! It's one of, there's no middle on this one.
I don't know. Sounds pretty great. Sounds fun.
Well, maybe
that shows a lot about me.
Warmly invited. Yes, and you and Myron can get up and go running while the rest of us do smart things like eat hot chocolate. All right, Tom, who do you take with you? One philosopher.
Geez, it's hard to beat that. What Kristin's idea? It's hard to beat that, but I'll have to go with J. Aaron Simmons because I don't think any other philosopher I've ever known about could handle the tent and anything that could go wrong. Do you think? Can you imagine me going with Bertrand Russell on a camping trip?
Okay, great.
He'd have his pipe though the whole time.
That's true.
I think I'd have to stick with Aaron because he knows the ins and outs of it like no philosopher I've ever heard of. So.
Oh my goodness. Well, I appreciate that, man. And you, as you know, I would go camping with you any day. I'd even hang out at the beach with you, which is saying,
that's a true testimony to friendship right there. Or
it takes a lot.
We could just make it easy and go roofing together.
See, you want to lay some sheetrock,
tan, and get something
accomplished. That's right. It's the same stuff. So my answers the past few weeks, I've said Simone de Beauvoir, Simone Weil. These were people I'd love to go camping with. I think tonight the person that I would love to sit around a campfire and think with, because I would love to hear his thoughts about where we are right now, is Bonhoeffer. So I think I would give anything for Bonhoeffer to be alive and to give us some insights into kind of, are we really, as J.D. Vance once said, risking the American Hitler with Trump, or are we overdoing these analogies, or are we really facing a threat to democracy, or maybe that's just the kind of thing that motivates people to get active? Like, I think Bonhoeffer might be one of the most authoritative voices from history that could speak to what it looks like to stand with confidence but not certainty in the face of troubled times. And I would love to be able to sit and listen to him.
Awesome.
So.
Well, that's a good choice. I mean, if I had to have a backup to you, it would be Plato, because he could chop the wood, I mean,
but Plato, I hear Heidegger was pretty good at chopping wood, but I actually don't know if that's true, or if he just like standing next to the wood pile in his German country garb.
Oh my goodness!
But
posing, posing next to the wood.
That's right. It's the. I can see Heidegger listening to Bon Iver for what it's worth.
Okay, all right.
There's something about the Flannel Brothers that I could see somehow rocking. Minus the anti-Semitism and horrifying Nazism of Heidegger. I think there's a little bit of the hey, let's just go hang out in the Black Forest and like pump our water from the well and sing falsetto.
The audience tonight to tell us whether this is the conversation degenerating or whether we've hit our peak now.
Well, it's hilarious. Well, I can say, because I can see the people watching in the live stream, our numbers have gone up and down wildly all night long.
Oh, wow.
And they have not budged since we started talking about the 5 questions. Like all the people are locked in. That, of course, it might be the case that everybody else immediately jumped ship, and so we only have
right. Okay.
Who can say?
Well, I cannot tell you how fun this has been. Thank you both, Kristin. Again, I am a huge fan. I want to grow up and be just like you, Tom. Your work continues to inspire me, and the world needs to hear more of it. So, thank you both for being with me. To everybody watching, either live, watching later on YouTube, or listening to us on Spotify, it's really important that you understand the reason that I do Campfire Philosophy with J.R. Simmons is because I am deeply invested in walking and talking with all of you. And I need your feedback, your engagement, your critique, your encouragement. So you can always reach out to me at simmonsphilosopher@gmail.com. You can find my website, just jaronsimmons.com. And please hop over to my Substack, Philosophy in the Wild, and connect with me there. I do 2 posts a week. This morning, for paid subscribers, they got a philosophical reflection on one of my favorite artists, Citizen Cope, and got to hear about why I think Let the Drummer Kick It is a good idea for all of us, combining groove and affect. So please do connect with me, any of those places. I want to hear from you. I'd love to get to know you. And for what it's worth, it's been so cool. I do some live Zoom meetings with subscribers and stuff about every other month. And that has led to like genuine friendships. And that's so right. I saw one, Michael was on here earlier asking some questions in the chat. He and I actually met in one of those live streams. I was giving a talk near where he lived, and we were able to go get some hot chicken together. So it's super cool to be able to realize none of us are sitting on the mountaintop, as it were, booming down into the valleys. Here is wisdom. We're inviting you to go for a walk with us wherever we find ourselves on the trails. And so I really appreciate everybody for supporting my work and reaching out either in critique or encouragement. I will take both. So one final plug, please go over to Planksip and make sure that you are using the code Aaron or camping, either one will work, and get a 50% off your first month subscription there at planksip.org. Thanks, as always, to Daniel Sanderson for all of his support and his encouragement. He does an amazing job, both encouraging me to do silly things like start a podcast, and then doing the production work and teaching me how to actually get it off the ground. And so a huge thanks to him. Please do check that out. And as one final plug, as I said when we first started, I do want to make sure that the other Campfire Philosophy YouTube channel, that I am encouraging you to check out their work as well. Check out their Campfire Philosophy YouTube channel. Really interesting stuff. I haven't listened to all their episodes, but Hamish and his colleague over there are doing really cool things. They've got about 50, 60 episodes they've done. And so I do want to always say none of this is about competition. It's all about mutual encouragement to other philosophers doing stuff in public. So do check out Hamish's work over at Campfire Philosophy on YouTube. All right. Well, again, thanks to our guests, Kristin and Tom. You guys are amazing. I am perpetually in your debt. And so to everybody else, we will see you next time. And in fact, next week, I'm putting together an episode about democracy and disagreement. And so where we ended tonight's conversation, we're going to try to pick up that next week with some political theorists and political philosophers. And so democracy and disagreement next week. Hope to see you all there, unless a piano falls on our heads. Thanks so much, everybody.
On the trail, for hiking with me a few miles more, for casting out your line into waters in which we both stand, for dropping in at the top and fist bumping me at the bottom, and for coming camping with me and Kierkegaard. Our time together has been so very worthy of my finitude. I hope it was worthy of